All right. Thank you very much. I wonder how you guys are all doing. It's been good to chat with some of you in classes or MFG. It'd be great to be together again. So I'm sharing a devotional that we did in our church yesterday. And we're starting a little series relating to what we're going through right now, but thinking about the need to go deeper with Christ in this time. And so I was assigned the first topic, which was about practicing the presence of Christ. And it made me think about what I sometimes see in our church foyer on a Sunday morning. And I see those little kids running around, and I wonder, what is their perspective? Are they just seeing legs and bodies and not much else? That's what it looks like to me. And that reminds me of Zacchaeus, who heard Jesus was in the neighborhood, but he couldn't see him because of his short stature. And this feeling of not being able to see over the heads of everyone else is a bit how I've been feeling lately. We've got the relentless news cycle, the growing list of changes to our daily activities, the anxiety about when this will all end and what life will look like then. And all of these can be like that crowd that kept Zacchaeus from seeing Jesus. And like Zacchaeus, we need a way to get up into a tree and get a different perspective, to get above that crowd of thoughts, of feelings, of news stories and conspiracy theories and social media posts, etc., to get that perspective in order to recognize that God is fully, really with us, to see him in the midst of this pandemic and its impact on our lives. There is never more of God available to us than right now in this present moment. There is never more of God available to us than right now. And as we practice tuning into God's presence, we will gain that different perspective and we will experience his shalom, a sense of well-being, of connectedness to each other and to God, of joy and peace. Our experiences have probably been somewhat different over these past weeks. Some of you, especially maybe commuters, you're still in the same location, except you're not going to classes at school. But in a sense, your life feels maybe somewhat the same. For those of you who've gone back home to a different province or a different country, but find yourself still in school, well, that's a bit of a weird thing to adjust to, right? Realizing I'm not home for summer break, I'm still in class. And all of us are learning how to do this work from home and perhaps picking up new skills and technology, which is where I've found myself as well in the past week. Teaching classes live online, figuring out how to do class discussions, how to show videos or not with a Mac, and participating in chapels like we're doing today. So in some ways, life carries on almost like normal. And yet, I've also felt a disorientation, feeling off kilter spiritually. And I was chatting with some friends about it last week and just trying to put my finger on it. It was hard for me to identify what it was. But it's something like this. I know how to be with God and to practice his presence in the ordinary circumstances of life. But how do I do it now? How do I relate to a God who sits above this messy planet, who observes the global chaos, and yet who I believe is also interested in each of our lives? It feels different somehow now. And I wonder, what is he thinking? I was thinking about this disorientation and I thought about Job and how he also experienced disorientation by the chaos wreaked in his life. And when that happened to him, he poured out a lot of lament and just kind of trying to figure it all out in conversation with God. And when God eventually spoke, God reminded him that I am bigger than it all. And this seemed to satisfy Job. But for me, this fact is exactly the sticking point. that God seems so remote. So how can we experience Emmanuel, God with us, at this time? So I want you to come with me in a little imagination and jump into a boat with the disciples. There are two stories like this in the Gospels of the disciples out in a storm on Lake Galilee, straining against the wind, waves threatening to swamp their boat. And I want to focus on the second one, especially as it's told us in Matthew chapter 14. Because I think the second story parallels our situation a bit better. Like the disciples, we've been sent off on our own. Jesus is not physically present with us, though we know the stories of how he's been there in the past. He's chosen to stay behind to pray. Is he praying for us? We're out on that lake at night, and the wind has picked up. At about 3 a.m, we're pulling for all our might on the oars when we see this ghostly figure coming towards us, disappearing from view behind a big wave and then visible again, coming towards us on top of the water. We cry out in fear, and the figure speaks. "Take heart, it is I." While Jesus could simply be saying, "It's me, guys, don't worry," the way it's phrased, ego eimi, also reminds us of God's self-designation in the Old Testament. It's the name God gave himself. I am. Ego eimi. It is I, Yahweh. Psalm 77 verse 19 says, "Your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters, yet your footprints were unseen." Just as I am, Yahweh treads the waters, so does Jesus. In his commentary, Michael Green says, Jesus has been praying for us, and he will come to us walking on the storm. When we trust him, he'll enable us to do the impossible. Peter, with his eyes on Jesus, took a huge step of faith. Leon Morris observes that what happened to Peter next is what happens to so many of us. Peter shifted his concentration from Jesus, who could enable him to overcome difficulties, to the difficulties in which he found himself. And the result was disastrous. So I wonder, what is threatening you in the waves around you? Anxiety, insecurity, unbelief, the threat of unemployment for the summer, sickness, guilt, loneliness. When our eyes shift from Jesus to the wind and the waves, we are overpowered. Peter begins with faith, responding to Jesus' presence. But then he notices the wind and fear grasps him, and the waves overpower again. But he cries out. It might be little faith, as Jesus calls it, but it is faith. The cry of doubt, of lament, of desperation is a word expressed to the God we believe could do something about this. And so it is a cry of faith. And Jesus responds to that cry. He reaches out with his firm grasp and he pulls Peter to safety. I want to share this picture with you. It's a stained glass window in City Church in Winnipeg. In 2008, when my husband and I had first moved to Winnipeg, we were just checking out different churches during the summer before we settled into a church. And we went to City Church one morning. It was a year and a half past a spiritual crisis in my life, and I was still finding my way out of that. Still trying to come to grips with God and who he was in my life. And I spent much of this church service just looking at this window beside me. And the way in which Jesus reaches out to grasp a hold of Peter really spoke to my heart in that time. And this morning, as I was just looking at it one more time, I noticed that in a way, it's like Jesus has grasped Peter and brought him into a dance move. It's like he's waltzing with him, one hand up and one hand around his waist. And it is perhaps the dance of faith. In some ways, Peter failed in this story. But despite that lapse of faith, God was with him. I'm sure that Peter remembered this story and retold it often. It would have become for him a way to return to the presence of God as he sought to lead the church through trying times in the following decades. Imagine there were times when people wondered, what is going on here? Like persecution is coming against us. How do we deal with this? And maybe Peter would have said, hey guys, remember that story I told you about Jesus in the storm and me walking towards him on the water? Don't worry, guys, he's got us. And this is one of the ways we too can practice the presence of Emmanuel, of God with us, by retelling those stories. In times of no shalom, remembering experiences of God's presence in the past can be a first step to recognizing his presence in this current situation. Remembering and expressing appreciation to God brings us back to a place of shalom. And in that frame of mind, we can once again be aware of God's presence and can invite him to help us see our circumstances now through his eyes. So instead of beating yourself up or getting frustrated with a family member who's not living aware of God's presence, take time to remember together experiences and things you have appreciated about God. Jake and I began to do this on our sabbatical last year. At the end of each day, as we were sitting together, we would do these 3 things. We would share something we had enjoyed in our day. We would share something we appreciated about someone. And often that was each other because we were the only 2 people we were seeing, kind of like you in your isolation right now. And we would share some aspect of God's character for which we were thankful. And it's a simple 1 + 1 + 1 practice. One thing we had enjoyed in our day, one aspect or something we had appreciated about someone else, and one aspect of God's character for which we were thankful. I want to offer that to you, that 1 + 1 + 1 practice. Perhaps it could become a new family ritual during this time of enforced closeness. Or maybe it's a way for you to reach out to your roommate at the end of a day and have that little chit chat that you used to have before you went to sleep. So that's one way of remembering Emmanuel, God with us. Some in my church family have shared how they're limiting their news intake and increasing their worship intake in order to keep things in the right perspective. And that's another way of practicing God's presence. I've found that to be important for me. And a final practice that's been helping me to slow down is to breathe deeply and pray the simple breath prayer. Breath of life, I give you thanks. And it's on the inhale, and I go, breath of life, I'm breathing in life. And I'm exhaling thanks. Breath of life, I give you thanks. It's a simple prayer, and it's one that can almost run in the back of my mind while I go about other tasks. But it reminds me that I draw every breath from God, and all thanks is due him. It seems to me a very fitting prayer for this time. There is never more of God available to us than right now in this present moment. Remembering this might take more strength these days. Sarah Cullen suggests that it may be like adding heavier weights to your workout routine. She says, a more strenuous workout leads to stronger muscles, so let us take heart. We may fail at times, but when we realize we've forgotten God, that's our chance to begin again, thanking God for his grace. There is grace for this too. The other day, my husband came home from the office and from, trying to figure all the stuff out of how to connect with the church family and how to run church on Sunday mornings. We're not used to live streaming, so he's kind of the tech guy at our church, and it had been stressful for him. And he said to me, I feel bad about how this day went because I didn't live in an awareness of God's presence, and I just reminded him, there's grace for this too. And sometimes we need to remind each other of that. And as we continue to practice tuning into God's presence, we will gain that above the crowd perspective and experience God's shalom, a sense of well-being, of connectedness to each other and God, of joy and peace. Colossians 3:15 sums this up. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body, and be thankful. Amen. Back to you, Patrick.
Thank you for watching this chapel service. If you'd like to see a few others, you can click the subscribe button or the link to the other videos.